In the dusty, forgotten ledgers of antebellum Arkansas, a single name appears beside a chilling notation. The year is 1849, the location is the Lawn Plantation, and the name is Abigail. Beside it, the master's hand wrote not of labor, but of purpose, for breeding, not for field. This was the beginning of a dark secret, a horrific family crime hidden within the brutal mathematics of slavery. The master of the estate, Edward Lawn, was a man of supposed Christian benevolence, yet he turned his plantation into a laboratory for a macabre project, using human beings as breeding cattle. The true horror, however, was not just in the act, but in the identity of its central victim. For what Edward Lawn discovered far too late was that the enslaved woman he exploited was his own sister. This is the story of that discovery, a macabre mystery of incestuous exploitation that even science would struggle to comprehend decades later. It is a tale of a family's terrifying truth, deliberately buried beneath the soil of a cursed estate, and of the sacred and profane evidence that ultimately refused to stay hidden. How could such a profound crime against nature and God remain a secret for so long, and what disturbing evidence finally brought the full, horrific truth of the Lawn family to light? The answers lie scattered in scorched Bible pages, in the hollowed eyes of a righteous witness, and in a small, sealed chest containing a crime that could not be outrun by time. So, if you believe that the darkest corners of history must be brought into the light, then we invite you to subscribe to Before the Story and enable notifications, so you never miss an investigation. Your like on this video helps us continue to unearth these forgotten tales. Now, let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The story of the Lawn Plantation does not begin in 1849 with a cruel ledger entry, but in 1892 with the cold, damp soil of a ruined estate. It was then that a post-Reconstruction historical commission, tasked with cataloging slave burial sites in Phillips County, Arkansas, made a discovery that was not part of their mandate. Their field journal, now preserved in the state archives, describes a place already haunted by the weight of its own silence. The great house was a skeletal ruin, its columns like bleached bones against a grey sky, and the land itself seemed resistant to new life, choked by weeds and tangled vines that suffocated the old cotton fields. The air, as the commission's lead historian noted, was heavy with an unnerving stillness. It was beneath the collapsed floorboards of what had once been a slave cabin, set apart from the others, that their shovels struck something solid. It was not a coffin, nor a loose stone from the foundation, but a small wooden chest, bound in rusted iron straps and sealed with hardened wax. The historian's journal entry for that day captures the moment with a sense of profound unease. He wrote, "The chest is small, but feels heavier than wood and iron alone. It feels weighted with an old and terrible silence, as if it were designed not to protect a treasure, but to imprison a truth." The object radiated a coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn air, a palpable sense of a story that had been violently concluded and deliberately buried. This chest, and the horrific mystery it contained, would eventually lead modern researchers back through the fragmented archives of the past. The journey would culminate in a sterile laboratory at the University of Arkansas in the late 20th century. There, a DNA analysis report, stark and clinical, would provide the final, irrefutable word. The report confirmed a direct familial link between bone fragments recovered from the chest, labeled Infant A and Infant B, and the surviving distant descendants of the Lawn family. The science was absolute, but it was merely the epilogue to a story of moral decay that science itself could never truly explain. It was the scientific confirmation of a spiritual and familial crime. The Commission in 1892 had no such tools. They had only the chest, the ruined land, and the faint whispers of local legend that spoke of the Lorne estate as a place shunned by both man and God. The plantation had been abandoned abruptly in the winter of 1851, its owner having fled in the night, leaving behind a legacy of whispered questions. The official records were suspiciously thin, hinting at a sudden financial collapse. But the truth, as the Commission was about to discover, was not a matter of finance. It was a matter of blood, a dark secret so profound that its owner had chosen to burn his history rather than face it, leaving the land to absorb the memory of his sins. The world of Edward Lorne, as it existed before its collapse, was one of carefully constructed facades. Helena, Arkansas, in the 1840s, was a burgeoning hub of the Cotton Kingdom, a place where fortunes were built on the backs of the enslaved with a brutal efficiency disguised by the trappings of Southern gentility. Edward Lorne was a pillar of this society, a widower known for his regular church attendance and his public pronouncements on the duties of a benevolent master. His plantation was seen as a model of order and productivity, a testament to his sober management and his supposed Christian virtue. This public image was a meticulously crafted lie. Behind the white columns and the veneer of piety, Lorne was engaged in something far more sinister than the already brutal system of chattel slavery. He was cultivating what he called, in his private papers, the lineage project. It was a secret, pseudo-scientific scheme to improve his human stock through a cruel calculus of forced pairings, treating human beings not as souls, but as a collection of desirable traits to be cultivated like prize cattle. It was an act of profound arrogance, an attempt to play God within the confines of his own isolated kingdom, hidden from the eyes of a society that, while brutal, might still have recoiled from such a cold and systematic perversion of life. The historical record, even after a century of silence, retained the faint echoes of this perversion. The Commission's discovery was not just the unearthing of a box, it was the unearthing of a carefully erased history. They stood on the precipice of a story about how the institution of slavery did not just permit cruelty, but could, in its darkest corners, foster a kind of monstrousness that obliterated the most fundamental boundaries of kinship and humanity. The silence of the land was not empty, it was the sound of a story waiting, with infinite patience, to be told. The journal of the Commission's historian reflects this dawning awareness. As his team worked to carefully transport the sealed chest back to their field office, he noted a change in his men. The usual gruff camaraderie of their work was replaced by a somber quiet. They handled the box with a strange reverence, as if they instinctively understood that they were not merely handling an artifact, but were now the custodians of a forgotten tragedy. The weight was indeed more than that of wood and iron. It was the weight of souls demanding a final accounting, a truth demanding its voice after decades of forced silence. That voice would first be found not in the chest itself, but in another document, a fragile, water-damaged journal that had survived by sheer chance, tucked away in the archives of a Methodist church in Little Rock. It was the personal diary of the Reverend Marcus Hale, a traveling minister who, in the winter of 1851, had been called to the Lorne plantation for what should have been a routine and joyous occasion. His testimony, written with a hand that trembled with righteous horror, would become the key to unlocking the terrible secret imprisoned within the chest. The Reverend Marcus Hale arrived at the Lawn Plantation in November of 1851, a man of God entering what he believed to be a house of respectable, if secular, order. His journal, written in a precise and steady hand, initially paints a picture of placid southern prosperity. He describes the main house with its grand entryway, the fields stretching to the horizon, and the owner, Edward Lorne, a man whose grief over his late wife seemed to have been channeled into a commendable piety and sober demeanor. Hale was there to officiate the christening of Lorne's infant son and heir, a symbol of continuity and divine blessing upon the family name. The atmosphere was one of quiet, dignified celebration. It was on his second day, during a moment of quiet reflection in the main hall, that Hale recorded the first documented anomaly. The entry is notable for its shift in tone, from calm observation to a sudden, creeping unease. He was examining the portraits of the Lorne ancestors, a gallery of stern, unsmiling faces that stared down from the walls. It was then that a young, light-skinned enslaved woman, whom he knew only as Abigail, passed through the hall on some domestic errand. She moved silently, her eyes fixed on the floor, a portrait of submission. But as she passed under the gilded frame of Edward Lorne's late mother, the Reverend saw something that made him pause. He wrote in his journal that evening, "A curious and unsettling thing occurred today. While in the main hall, I observed the serving girl, Abigail, pass before the portrait of Mr. Lorne's late mother. The resemblance is so profound as to be unnatural, the same eyes, the same line of the jaw. A trick of the light, I told myself, yet the image refuses to leave my mind." This was not a fleeting similarity. It was, as he described it, a perfect echo, a living reflection of the painted woman on the wall. The same high cheekbones, the same dark, deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a quiet sorrow. It was a biological impossibility, a paradox that his rational mind struggled to dismiss. The anomaly was so jarring because of the rigid, unbreachable lines of the society in which he lived. Such a resemblance should not exist. The world was divided into master and slave, white and black, owner and property. To see the face of the mistress so perfectly mirrored in the face of her slave was to witness a disruption in the natural order of things, a genetic ghost that hinted at a transgression buried in the family's past. Hale, a man accustomed to seeing the world through a lens of moral and social order, was deeply disturbed by this visual contradiction. It was a dissonant note in the carefully composed symphony of plantation life. He tried to reason it away, attributing it to the flickering candlelight or his own weary imagination. But the image was seared into his memory. He found himself seeking out glimpses of Abigail as she worked, studying her face from a distance, comparing it again and again to the portrait in the hall. Each time, the resemblance struck him with renewed force. It was in the way she held her head, in the delicate structure of her hands, in 1,000 small details that conspired to create an impossible duplicate. The girl was a living testament to a connection that should not, could not, be. This observation marked the beginning of Hale's descent into the dark heart of the Lorne family. It was the first thread he pulled unknowingly that would unravel the entire tapestry of lies Edward Lorne had woven around himself. The anomaly was purely visual, a matter of bone structure and inherited traits. But for a man like Hale, the physical world was always a reflection of a deeper, spiritual reality. To him, this impossible resemblance was not a coincidence. It was a sign, a portent of a hidden truth demanding to be seen, a moral disfigurement manifesting itself in the flesh. He wrote nothing more of it for several days, as if committing the thought to paper again would give it too much power. But the observation lingered, coloring his perception of the entire estate. He began to see the meticulously maintained grounds not as a symbol of order, but as a carefully guarded cage. He perceived the quiet deference of the enslaved people not as contentment, but as a heavy, watchful silence. The house, which had at first seemed grand, now felt oppressive, its long hallways holding their breath, its rooms saturated with unspoken secrets. The resemblance was a key, and it had unlocked a door in his mind to a much darker house within the house. This single, inexplicable detail transformed Reverend Hale from a passive visitor into an unwilling investigator. He had come to bless a child and sanctify a family's lineage, but he now found himself questioning the very foundation of that lineage. The girl Abigail, previously invisible to him as an individual, was now the focal point of a profound and disturbing mystery. Her face, a perfect copy of a dead mistress, was a silent accusation, though Hale did not yet know the nature of the crime it alleged. The power of this first anomaly lay in its subtlety. It was not an open act of violence or a spoken confession. It was a quiet, persistent fact that could not be reconciled with the official narrative of the Lorne family. It was evidence written not in ink, but in blood and bone, a biological signature of a history that had been deliberately suppressed. Hale, a man of faith, was accustomed to looking for truth in hidden places, in parables and symbols. He now found himself confronted with a symbol he could not interpret, a parable whose moral he could not yet grasp, and the unease it produced in him was the true beginning of this horrific story. Driven by the unsettling mystery of Abigail's resemblance to the Lorne matriarch, Reverend Hale sought to understand her place within the plantation's ecosystem. A man of his station was afforded a degree of access, and on the pretext of understanding the logistical operations of the estate, he asked to see the plantation ledgers. He presented it as a curiosity about the management of such a large enterprise, a benign inquiry that masked a deeper, more urgent need for answers. Edward Lorne, confident in his systems and his secrets, obliged him. The ledger was a massive, leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat columns of names, ages, and duties, a chilling testament to the reduction of human life to mere inventory. It was there, on a page dedicated to the female slaves of working age, that Hale found the second piece of anomalous evidence. He ran his finger down the list of names: Sarah, cook; Mary, field hand; Ruth, seamstress. Then he found her name: Abigail. Beside it, the entry was starkly different from the others. It did not list a task or a skill. Instead, the entry, written in Lorne's own precise, emotionless script, read, "Age 23, for breeding, not for field." The words struck Hale with the force of a physical blow. It was a classification of cold, calculated utility, stripping away even the pretense of humanity afforded to others. She was not a person. She was an instrument, a vessel for a specific purpose. This discovery contextualized the deep, abiding sorrow he had seen in her eyes. It was not the general malaise of bondage, but a specific, targeted form of exploitation. Disturbed, Hale then turned his attention to the plantation's birth ledger, a separate, smaller volume where the births of enslaved children were recorded. He found Abigail's name again. Beneath it were 2 entries, dated over the previous 2 years. They did not contain names, only initials, JL and ML, and beside each set of initials, a single, devastating word: transferred. The children had been born, recorded, and then vanished from the record, their existence reduced to a pair of letters and a logistical transaction. Hale's journal from that evening reveals a man grappling with a dawning horror. He described his attempts to discreetly inquire about the children. He asked the overseer, a hard, taciturn man named Finch, about the practice of selling infants. Finch was evasive, claiming that the transfers were to another of Lorne's properties, a common practice. Yet his eyes would not meet Hale's, and his answers were clipped and defensive. The minister then tried to speak to some of the older enslaved women, but his questions were met with a wall of fearful silence. They would lower their heads and murmur that it was not their place to say, their faces masks of a terror so ingrained it had become a feature of their existence. The accumulation of this evidence began to paint a terrifying picture. The resemblance, the ledger notation, the ghost children recorded only by initials, they were all connected. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit, and the image they formed was one of monstrous cruelty. Hale now understood the nature of Abigail's sorrow. It was the grief of a mother twice over whose children had been taken from her, a grief with no name and no body to mourn, as he had written. Her purpose, as defined by her master, was to produce life that would then be systematically erased from her own. The atmosphere of the plantation now seemed to Hale to be thick with this unspoken crime. The silence of the enslaved people was not born of submission, but of a shared, terrifying knowledge. They knew what happened to Abigail's children. They knew the rules of this place, and they knew the price of speaking the truth. Abigail herself moved through this charged silence like a phantom. Hale observed her from a distance, noting the mechanical way she performed her duties. Her body present, but her spirit seemingly absent, retreated to some inner place where the pain was too great to be witnessed by the outside world. He saw her once, standing near the stand of oak trees that bordered the slave quarters, looking out towards the road, as if waiting for someone who would never return. The look on her face, as he described it in his journal, was one of a profound, soul-deep sorrow, the look of a person who has had the very roots of her being torn out of the earth. It was a grief so complete that it had consumed her, leaving behind an empty shell. This image, more than the cold entries in the ledger, solidified for Hale the true nature of the evil that permeated the Lorne estate. It was not just a system of labor, it was a system of soul murder. The evidence was now a chain of 3 links, a face that should not exist, a purpose that should not be assigned, and children who had ceased to be. Each link was more damning than the last, and together they formed an indictment not just of Edward Lorne, but of the entire system that enabled and protected him. The world of the plantation, with its veneer of Christian charity and Gentile order, was a carefully constructed lie designed to conceal a heart of absolute darkness. Hale had come to this place as a servant of God, but he was quickly becoming a witness for the damned. His own faith was shaken by what he was uncovering. How could a man like Lorne profess to be a Christian while engaging in such acts? How could a society of supposedly God-fearing people turn a blind eye to such abominations? These questions tormented him, keeping him awake at night, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He felt as though he had been dropped into a well, and the light of the world he knew was receding, replaced by a suffocating darkness. The accumulation of evidence was not just an intellectual exercise, it was a spiritual ordeal, forcing him to confront a depth of human depravity he had never imagined. Dr. Sudden, with the evidence of the ledgers and the palpable, silent grief of the enslaved community weighing upon him, Reverend Hale retreated to the solitude of his room to assemble the facts into a coherent, if horrifying, narrative. His journal from the eve of the christening is a document of profound moral anguish, a man attempting to give a name to the evil he had witnessed. He spread his notes before him, The facts like pieces of a shattered soul, the mother's face on the slave girl, the chilling designation for breeding, the ghostly initials of vanished children. He sought the most logical explanation, the most rational conclusion that could be drawn from within the twisted logic of the slave system itself. His first hypothesis was that Edward Lorne was a different kind of monster than he had initially imagined, but a recognizable one nonetheless. He concluded that Lorne was engaged in the particularly cruel but not unheard of practice of slave breeding for the market. He theorized that Abigail, with her light skin and delicate features, traits that fetched a higher price in the horrifying markets of New Orleans, was the centerpiece of a deliberate program to produce high-value commodities. Lorne was not just a planter, he was a human stockman, and his lineage project was a matter of cold, hard profit. This conclusion, as Hale recorded it, seemed to explain everything. It accounted for the systematic nature of the births and the subsequent transfers. It explained the secrecy and the fear that permeated the slave quarters. The selling of one's own people was common, but the systematic breeding and selling of infants was a practice even many slaveholders considered to be a step beyond the pale, a violation of the last vestiges of moral decency. It was a sin of commerce, a perversion of the natural bond between mother and child in the name of greed. This was the evil Hale prepared himself to confront. He wrote in his journal with a righteous fire, "The man's piety is a cloak. He speaks of God's grace while running a human stockyard. He sells children torn from their mother's arms. It is a damnable sin, a violation of the natural affections God has placed in all his creatures. I must speak to him of this corruption, not as a minister to a benefactor, but as a man of God, to a sinner whose soul is in mortal peril." His hypothesis gave him a clear target for his moral outrage. It was a recognizable evil, a sin he could name and condemn, using the familiar language of his faith. Yet, even as he formulated this theory, a nagging doubt remained, a piece of the puzzle that did not quite fit. That piece was the resemblance. If this was purely a commercial enterprise, why Abigail? Why the girl who bore the face of Lorne's own mother? It was too specific, too personal. A coincidence, he tried to tell himself, a cruel accident of genetics. But the thought continued to trouble him. The resemblance felt like more than a random quirk. It felt like a signature, a deliberate mark of ownership that went beyond the legalities of slavery. It hinted at a deeper, more personal depravity that his current theory could not explain. His journal entries from this period reflect this internal conflict. He would write with certainty about the commercial breeding operation, mapping out the moral arguments he would present to Lorne. But then his thoughts would circle back to the portrait in the hall, to the impossible echo of a face across the racial divide. He described it as a splinter in the eye of his reasoning, a detail that resisted easy categorization. This detail suggested that the crime was not just about money, but about something far more twisted, something rooted in the dark, tangled history of the Lorne family itself. Despite this lingering doubt, he settled on the more rational explanation. The human mind seeks patterns it can understand, and the pattern of greed was far more comprehensible than the alternative that was beginning to form in the darkest corners of his imagination. He would confront Lorne on the grounds of his inhumanity, his profaning of the sacred bond of motherhood for financial gain. This was a sin he was equipped to handle, a moral battle he felt prepared to fight. He would be the voice for the voiceless, the champion of the discarded children. This hypothesis was a necessary step in Hale's journey toward the truth. It was the last moment of a certain kind of innocence, The last time he would believe that the evil at the heart of the lawn plantation was a recognizable and classifiable sin. He was preparing to confront a monster, but he had mistaken the nature of the beast. The horror was not in the commodification of life, as he believed. The horror was in the creation of it, in the deliberate systematic violation of a taboo so ancient and so profound that it lay at the very foundation of human society. He ended his entry that night with a prayer, asking for the strength to speak truth to power, to bring a man of wealth and influence to account for his sins. He prayed for the souls of the children, JL and ML, wherever they were. He prayed for the hollowed-out soul of their mother, Abigail. His prayer was earnest and heartfelt, but it was directed at the wrong sin. The truth was waiting for him, not in the ledger of commerce, but in the ledger of blood, hidden within the pages of the most sacred book in the house. The day of the christening dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn day in Arkansas. The lawn estate, scrubbed and polished for the occasion, was a picture of southern grace. Carriages arrived throughout the morning, depositing guests in their finest attire onto the manicured lawns. The air was filled with the sound of polite conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that had so unsettled Reverend Hale in the preceding days. This was the public face of the lawn plantation, a world of order, prosperity, and communal celebration. For Hale, however, it was a profoundly fractured reality. His journal entry from that day is a study in dissonance. He describes the scene in the drawing room, the wealthy planters and their wives discussing crop prices and local politics. He quotes one guest, a neighboring plantation owner, who claps Edward Lorne on the back and praises his remarkable fortitude in raising a new son after the tragedy of his wife's passing. The community saw Lorne as a sympathetic figure, a man of standing who was dutifully carrying on his family name. They were all complicit, Hale realized, in the grand illusion of benevolence that masked the brutality of their shared enterprise. The social fracture was not in the community, but within Hale himself. He was the only one present who saw the two worlds simultaneously, the sunlit world of the drawing room and the shadowy world of the slave quarters, the celebrated heir in his lace christening gown and the unmourned initial children who had vanished. He wrote, "I performed the rites, but the words felt like ash in my mouth. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and this house is built on a foundation of lies." Each word of the sacred liturgy felt like a profanity, a blessing bestowed upon a cursed foundation. He watched Edward Lorne cradle his legitimate son, his face a mask of paternal pride. It was a convincing performance, Hale noted, the performance of a man completely at ease with his own contradictions. Lorne could stand before God and his community, accept their blessings for one child, while operating a system that erased the existence of others. This moral compartmentalization, Hale concluded, was perhaps the greatest sin of all. It was a soul sickness that allowed men to commit monstrous acts while still seeing themselves as righteous. The entire society seemed to suffer from this same sickness. The ceremony took place in a small chapel Lorne had built on the estate, a further testament to his public piety. As Hale spoke the words of baptism over the infant, he saw Abigail standing in the shadows at the back of the chapel, her presence required for some domestic task. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. In her gaze, he saw not anger or defiance, but a profound, bottomless emptiness, the look of a person for whom sacred words and rituals had lost all meaning. She was a ghost at the feast, a silent witness to a ceremony that celebrated the very system that was destroying her. After the service, during the celebratory meal, Hale found himself unable to participate in the cheerful charade. He felt a growing sense of isolation, as if he were separated from the other guests by a pane of invisible glass. They saw a christening. He saw a desecration. They saw a pillar of the community. He saw a man whose soul was a wasteland. He recorded in his journal the snippets of conversation he overheard, gossip, business, talk of buying and selling land and people as if they were one and the same. It was the casual, unthinking dehumanization that he found most chilling. This experience solidified Hale's resolve. His confrontation with Lorne would not be a quiet word of clerical advice. It would be an accusation, a judgment. The social fracture he experienced was the chasm between the world as it was presented and the world as it truly was. He now understood that his role was not just to save one man's soul, but to bear witness to the soul rot of an entire system. The polished surfaces of Lorne's home, the fine china, the polite conversation, it was all a thin veneer over a pit of moral decay. The guests departed as the sun began to set, their carriages rolling away down the long drive, leaving the plantation to its evening quiet. The performance was over. Hale watched them go, feeling a sense of pity for their willful blindness. They were all participants in the lie, upholding the fiction of a genteel Christian society built on a foundation of human suffering. They were all, in their own way, as guilty as Lorne. Their polite applause at the end of the christening was an endorsement of the whole corrupt enterprise. That evening, Hale prepared for his final duty at the estate, to record the birth and baptism of the new heir in the Lorne family Bible. This act, usually a simple and pleasant task, now felt freighted with immense symbolic weight. He would be adding another name to a lineage he now knew to be corrupt, writing a new chapter in a book of lies. It was this final official act of documentation that would, by a stroke of what he could only describe as divine providence, lead him from the realm of hypothesis into the heart of the irrefutable, unthinkable truth. In the quiet of Edward Lorne's study that evening, with the lingering scent of cigar smoke and old leather in the air, Reverend Hale placed the Lorne family Bible on the large mahogany desk. It was an impressive volume, bound in dark, cracked leather and embossed with a faded gold cross. It was an artifact of the family's history, a repository of its lineage, its births, marriages and deaths, recorded in elegant script over generations. This book was the ultimate symbol of the family's legitimacy, its claim to a respectable and God-fearing heritage. It was here that the final, most terrible truth was hiding. As he opened the book to the section reserved for the family record, his fingers brushed across the pages. His journal entry from that night describes the moment with a strange, tactile clarity. He wrote, "The pages dedicated to the Lorne lineage felt unnaturally thick. One page, near the beginning of the records from the previous generation, had been glued fast to another. It was not the clumsy work of a damaged book. It was a deliberate act of concealment. The page was sealed with a thin, almost invisible line of adhesive, a subtle but undeniable act of historical revision. His heart began to pound in his chest. A buried truth lay beneath his fingertips. Driven by a sense of dreadful certainty, Hale carried the heavy Bible to the fireplace, where a small kettle had been left to boil. He knew he was committing a profound transgression, risking the desecration of a sacred object. But he also knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that a greater desecration had already occurred. Holding the glued pages carefully over the rising steam, he worked patiently, the warm moisture slowly weakening the old adhesive. His journal describes the painstaking process, the fear of tearing the fragile, brittle paper, the sense of unearthing something that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. After several tense minutes, The pages began to separate. He worked a thin blade between them and gently prized them apart. There, on the hidden surface of the page that had been concealed, was not a full record, but a torn fragment of a document, pasted into the book and then sealed away. It was a birth certificate, written in the spidery hand of a county midwife and dated 1828, the year of Edward Lorne's own birth. Hale's hand trembled as he held the book closer to the candlelight, his eyes scanning the faded ink. The words he read shattered his hypothesis and his understanding of the world. His journal transcribes the text with a script that grows agitated and almost illegible with horror. The certificate read, "Female infant, born to Margaret Lorne, name Abigail, father noted as property of this house." The name of the mother was not Edward's mother, but his father's wife, who had died years ago. The child was not the product of some anonymous union, but was the daughter of the Lorne matriarch herself, conceived in an affair with an enslaved man. But the most catastrophic revelation was the simple, undeniable mathematics of the birth year. Abigail was Edward Lorne's half-sister. The impact on Hale was immediate and overwhelming. He described a feeling of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away from beneath him. The pieces of the puzzle crashed together in his mind with sickening force. The resemblance was not a coincidence. It was a direct bloodline. The lineage project was not a commercial enterprise. It was a campaign of incestuous exploitation. The sin was not greed, it was abomination. The word echoed in his mind, a tolling bell of damnation. He stumbled back from the desk, the open Bible lying on its surface like a gaping wound. He now understood the full, monstrous scope of Edward Lorne's crime. Lorne was not just a cruel master, he was a man who had systematically violated his own blood, turning his sister into an instrument for producing children who were simultaneously his nieces and nephews, and his property. He had taken his own kin and subjected her to a horror that defied language. The very foundations of nature and divine law had been shattered in this house. The careful separation of master and slave, the bedrock of his society, was a lie. The blood of both flowed in the same veins. The evidence was irrefutable, written in the family's own sacred record. The act of gluing the page was a confession, a desperate attempt to erase a history that could not be undone. The torn certificate was a ghost, a stubborn fragment of truth that had refused to be silenced. Hale felt a wave of nausea, the physical revulsion that comes from staring into an abyss of human depravity. He had come to this house to condemn a sin of commerce, but he had found a sin of origins, a corruption so profound it seemed to poison the very air he breathed. He paced the room, his mind reeling, his faith pushed to its breaking point. He had seen the face of evil, and it was not the face of a simple brute or a greedy merchant. It was the face of a man who had calmly and rationally decided to obliterate the sacred boundaries of kinship for his own perverse purposes. The Bible, the source of his moral authority, had become the source of the ultimate indictment. It was no longer just a book of scripture. It was an exhibit in a trial, and Hale knew with terrifying certainty that he had just been appointed the prosecutor. Armed with the horrifying truth of the desecrated Bible, Reverend Hale felt the last of his clerical deference burn away, replaced by the cold, hard fury of a prophet. There could be no quiet word of counsel, no gentle appeal to conscience. There could only be judgment. His journal provides a breathless, almost moment-by-moment account of the confrontation that followed. He did not wait for the morning. He sent a servant to summon Edward Lorne to his study immediately, a reversal of the established hierarchy that signaled the gravity of the moment. Lorne entered the room with an air of mild annoyance, a master disturbed from his evening repose. Hale did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply pointed to the open Bible on the desk, its wounded pages exposed under the lamplight. He said nothing, letting the silence and the evidence speak for themselves. Lorne approached the desk, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion, and then to a dawning, sickening comprehension as his eyes fell upon the revealed certificate. His face, Hale wrote, seemed to collapse inward, the confident mask of the patriarch dissolving to reveal the panicked, hollowed-out thing beneath. The authority of his position, his wealth, his race, all of it evaporated in an instant. He snatched the paper and stared at it as if it were a serpent, Hale wrote. He denied it, called me a liar, a meddler, his voice a ragged whisper. He accused me of fabricating the document, of trying to ruin him. But the denial was weak, brittle. The evidence was too absolute, its source too sacred. It was not Hale's word against his. It was the word of his own family's history against his lies. The authority in the room had shifted entirely. Hale, the itinerant minister, was now the arbiter of truth, and Lorne, the powerful planter, was a sinner exposed in the dock. The rage soon gave way to a complete and terrifying breakdown. Lorne sank into his chair, his body trembling, a man utterly broken by the unearthing of his foundational sin. Hale wrote, "He did not confess with his mouth, but with his soul." The truth was a judgment from which there was no appeal. He began to weep, not tears of remorse, but of a terrible selfish despair, the sound of a man mourning not his crime, but his own discovery. In that moment, he was no longer a master, no longer a pillar of the community. He was just a man drowning in the filth of his own making. The collapse was not just personal, it was symbolic. In Lorne's breakdown, Hale witnessed the collapse of the entire moral authority of the master class. Their power, he realized, was built on a series of carefully maintained fictions. The fiction of their own benevolence, the fiction of racial purity, the fiction of a divinely ordained social order. The torn certificate had ripped a hole in all of it, revealing the incestuous, violent, and hypocritical reality that lay beneath. Lorne's authority was a house of cards, and a single, fragile piece of paper had brought it all down. Hale's journal does not record what he said in response. Perhaps he said nothing. His role was not to offer absolution, for the crime was beyond absolution. His role was simply to be the instrument of the truth's revelation. He had held up a mirror, and the reflection had destroyed the man who looked into it. The confrontation ended not with a resolution, but with a dismissal. Lorne, his voice devoid of all its former command, told Hale to be gone by morning. It was not an order, but a plea, the desperate wish of a man to banish the witness to his own damnation. The aftermath was swift and chaotic, a testament to the totality of Lorne's collapse. Hale departed at dawn, leaving the plantation under a shroud of grim silence. But news traveled, even from such an isolated place. Weeks later, in Helena, Hale heard the reports. Edward Lorne had descended into a paranoid frenzy. He was seen burning his papers and ledgers in a great bonfire that lit up the night sky, a frantic attempt to erase his own history. He had dismissed his overseer and sold his entire population of enslaved people, including presumably Abigail, to traders heading for the deep south, scattering the witnesses to his crime to the winds. Finally, one night, he vanished. He abandoned the plantation, his newborn son, his land, his name, everything. He simply fled, a refugee from a truth he could not face. The Lorne estate, once a model of productivity, fell silent. The authority that had held it together was gone, and nature began the slow, inexorable process of reclaiming the land. The collapse was absolute. The master had been unmade, his kingdom dismantled, his power revealed as nothing more than a carefully guarded secret. Hale's final entry on the matter is somber and reflective. He had won the confrontation, but it felt like a hollow victory. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? Abigail and the other enslaved people had been sold south, their fates likely worse than before. Lorne's legitimate son was left an orphan. The land was left to rot. The truth had not brought restoration or justice. It had simply brought destruction. It was a sterile, cleansing fire that had burned away the corruption, but had left nothing but ashes in its wake. The authority had collapsed, but the void it left behind was filled only with more questions and a profound, lingering sorrow. The narrative now returns to the cold autumn day in 1892, to the historical commission and the sealed wooden chest that sat before them in their makeshift field office. The story of Reverend Hale, preserved in his journal, provided the context for the horror, the motive for the crime. But the chest itself was the final, physical evidence. It was the hidden source, the archive of the victim, a testament created not with ink and paper, but with bone and ribbon and a mother's final, desperate curse. The very existence of the chest was a profound act of resistance, a secret burial designed to be a permanent record. The Commission's own journal details the moment they decided to open it. The lead historian, a man named Alistair Finch, no relation to the overseer, describes the chest with an archaeologist's precision. It was made of cypress wood, resistant to rot, and the iron straps were pitted with age but unbroken. The wax seals, stamped with a simple, unidentifiable mark, were brittle but intact. Whoever had sealed this box had intended for it to remain sealed for eternity, a small, private monument to an unspeakable tragedy. Its careful construction spoke of a ritual, a deliberate act of memory in the face of forced erasure. The historians documented their process meticulously, understanding that they were treading on sacred, if profane, ground. They photographed the chest from all angles before attempting to open it. They carefully scraped away the wax seals, collecting the fragments in a small envelope. There was no lock. The straps were nailed shut with hand-forged nails, requiring them to use a small pry bar to slowly and carefully lift the lid. The sound of the nails pulling free from the old wood, Finch wrote, was like a long, low groan, the chest itself seeming to resist giving up its terrible secret. When the lid was finally lifted, there was no immediate, shocking reveal. The contents were covered by a layer of folded, yellowed linen, which had mostly held up against the dampness of the soil. The air that rose from the box was thick and musty, the smell of confined earth and slow decay. For a moment, the commission members simply stood in silence, looking at that simple cloth covering. It was a threshold, and they all understood that once they crossed it, the story of the Lorne plantation would be irrevocably changed. The whispers of local legend were about to be replaced by the hard, undeniable evidence of a crime. Beneath the linen lay the source of the chest's unnatural weight. It was not treasure, not documents, not the saved possessions of a fleeing slave. It was a burial. The historians, hardened men accustomed to the grim realities of their work, cataloguing the dead, were visibly shaken. Finch's journal entry becomes less clinical at this point, his handwriting showing signs of haste and emotion. He describes the contents with a kind of reverent horror, the objective voice of the historian giving way to the shocked voice of a human being. The hidden source was not a story about slavery. It was a story about a mother and her lost children. The chest was Abigail's only voice, her only diary, her only headstone, Unable to write her own story, she had created this small, secret archive of her pain. She had saved the physical proof of her children's existence and their fate. The careful placement of the items within the box suggested a ritual of mourning, a private funeral for children who would have no other. This was not just a hiding place, it was a sanctuary, a desperate attempt to preserve the memory of her offspring in a system that was designed to erase them completely. The discovery of this hidden source fundamentally shifted the Commission's understanding of their work. They were no longer just cataloguing burial sites, they were exhuming a murder case. The chest was a message sent across time, a plea for remembrance from a woman whose name had been otherwise wiped from the historical record. It was the ultimate primary source, raw and unmediated, speaking a truth that was more powerful than any written document. It was the physical manifestation of a mother's love and a victim's righteous fury. Finch noted the location of the discovery with great care, directly beneath the hearthstone of Abigail's cabin. It had been hidden in the one place that was the symbolic heart of a home, a place of warmth and family. This detail added another layer of poignant tragedy to the discovery. Abigail had buried her children at the center of her own desolate, broken home, keeping them close to her in the only way she could. The hearth, which should have been a place of life, had become the guardian of her dead. The weight the commissioners felt was now understandable. They were holding the physical remains of a family's complete and utter implosion. They were the first people in over 40 years to bear witness to Abigail's secret, the first to hear her silent scream from across the decades. The hidden source, once unearthed, demanded a response. It demanded that its story be told, that its truth be entered into the historical record. The silence of the Lorne estate had finally been broken, not by a voice, but by the irrefutable testimony of bone. At Ban-Bazum, the unearthing of what was clearly a secret burial placed the Historical Commission in a difficult position. Their mandate was to survey and catalogue known or suspected slave cemeteries, not to conduct forensic investigations into potential crimes. The Commission's journal records a lengthy and sober debate that took place that evening. The sealed chest sitting on the table in the center of their room like a silent judge. Some members argued that they should treat the site as a grave, document its location, and leave the contents undisturbed, respecting the dead. The lead historian, Alistair Finch, argued for a different course of action. His justification, recorded in his own hand in the Commission's official log, became the guiding principle for what followed. He wrote, "Given the location, hidden within the living quarters, not in the designated burial ground, and the careful, clandestine sealing of the chest, we are not treating this as a sanctified grave. It is evidence of a secret, an act of concealment. Our duty is not to piety for a burial that was never sanctified, but to the historical record, however terrible it may be. To leave this chest unopened is to be complicit in the silence that has surrounded this place for 40 years. Finch's argument was that their primary responsibility was to the truth. The nature of the concealment suggested a crime, and to ignore it would be a dereliction of their duty as historians. He posited that the person who buried the chest did not do so with the expectation of religious sanctity, but with the desperate, fading hope that the truth might one day be discovered. The chest was not a final resting place. It was a time capsule of an atrocity. To respect the dead, in this case, meant giving them their story, not leaving them in an unmarked, unacknowledged prison of earth and wood. This decision was not made lightly. The men understood the moral weight of their choice. They were about to violate what might have been a mother's private memorial, but Finch's logic prevailed. The context of the lawn plantation's history, with the sudden disappearance of its owner and the rumors that still clung to the land, demanded a full accounting. The chest was the only surviving witness, and it was their obligation to hear its testimony. The decision for decisive action was thus framed not as an act of desecration, but as an act of historical justice. The justification was also practical. As a state-sanctioned commission, they had the authority to investigate anomalies related to their work. The discovery of human remains outside of a designated cemetery was, by definition, an anomaly that fell under their purview. Finch argued that they had a legal and professional obligation to identify the remains and determine the circumstances of their burial. This provided the official cover for an action that was, at its heart, driven by a profound moral curiosity and a sense of duty to the forgotten victims of a brutal past. The preparations for opening the chest were carried out with the solemnity of a surgical procedure. They documented every step, understanding that their actions would be scrutinized. This meticulous process was part of their justification, a way of demonstrating that their decision was not born of morbid curiosity, but of a commitment to historical and archaeological rigor. They were not treasure hunters, they were scholars, and their decisive action would be governed by the principles of their discipline. They would be the voice of the evidence, translating its silent language for the historical record. Finch's journal reveals the personal toll of this decision. He wrote of his own misgivings, of the feeling that he was intruding on a grief so profound it was almost holy in its intensity. But he kept returning to the central point. Silence benefits the oppressor, not the victim. To leave the chest buried would be to honor the secrecy that Edward Lorne had relied upon. To open it would be to honor Abigail's desperate, final act of remembrance. The choice was between perpetuating a silence that protected a monster or breaking that silence to give voice to his victim. Thus, the decision was made. The commission would proceed. They would open the chest, inventory its contents, and record their findings for posterity. Their action was a declaration that no truth, no matter how horrific, should remain buried forever. It was a commitment to the idea that history is not just a record of the powerful, but also a search for the lost stories of the powerless. They would act not as judges, but as witnesses, letting the contents of the chest speak for themselves. The final lines of Finch's justification in the log are a poignant reflection on their role. He concluded, "We may be condemned by some for this action, but I believe we would be more rightly condemned by history if we did nothing. We act in the belief that the truth once known is always preferable to a lie, however comfortable. Let the contents of this box bear witness. We are now its humble servants." With that, the debate was over. The course was set. The final terrible truth of the Lorne plantation was about to be brought into the light. With their decision made and justified, the commission proceeded to open the chest. The moment is recorded in their log with a detached clinical prose that only serves to amplify the horror of the discovery. The final primary source was not a single document, but the collection of objects within the chest, a curated exhibit of sorrow and rage. As the lid was lifted and the linen cloth folded back, the contents were revealed. The air in the room grew heavy and still. The historian stood in silence for a long moment, bearing witness to the final, brutal chapter of the Lorne family tragedy. The official inventory log, transcribed directly from the Commission's records, provides the starkest account. The first items noted were the skeletal remains. The log reads, Item 1, skeletal remains, infant, estimated age 2 to 4 weeks. Pathological analysis, notes no signs of trauma. Cause of death undetermined. Item 2. Skeletal remains. Infant estimated age 4 to 6 weeks. Similarly, no physical trauma is apparent on the bones. These were the children from the ledger, JL and ML, their brief lives and anonymous deaths now given a grim physical reality. They had not been transferred, they had been disposed of, their bodies hidden away by the only person in the world who mourned them. The next item on the log provides the first trace of a human personal touch, a stark contrast to the coldness of the bones. The entry reads, Item 3. A lock of dark, wavy hair, bound with a faded blue ribbon. The hair was almost certainly Abigail's, a mother's final desperate act of connection, placing a part of herself with her lost children for eternity. This small, fragile object spoke more eloquently of her grief than any written words ever could. It was a symbol of her love, her identity as a mother, buried alongside the evidence of her profound loss. It transformed the contents from a mere collection of remains into a memorial. But it was the final item, lying at the bottom of the chest, that provided the narrative, the motive, and the final damning judgment. It was a single folded piece of paper, scorched at the edges as if it had been snatched from a fire. The paper was brittle, and the historians had to handle it with extreme care. It appeared to be a page torn from a Bible. On it, in a neat, surprisingly steady feminine hand, was a single, terrifying inscription. The inventory log records it as Item 4. One fragment of paper, scorched at the edges, appearing to be a page torn from a Bible. The legible text, written in ink, reads, Genesis 19:36. He sowed seed upon his own blood. May God not forgive him. Din-du. This was Abigail's only written testimony, her final statement. The biblical citation, Genesis 19:36, refers to the story of Lot and his daughters, a passage concerning incest. The meaning was unambiguous. Abigail knew the truth of her relation to Edward Lorne. Whether she had always known or had discovered it somehow, the note was a confirmation of the crime from the victim herself. It was not just a lament, it was a curse, a direct appeal to a higher power for a justice she would never find on earth. The phrase, "he sowed seed upon his own blood," was a perfect, horrifying summary of the entire tragedy. The interpretation of this final source was immediate and undeniable. The chest was not just a secret grave, it was a reliquary of a crime, a carefully assembled collection of evidence intended for a final judgment, whether divine or historical. Abigail had buried her children with a lock of her own hair, a symbol of their kinship and a written confession and condemnation of their father. The scorched edges of the paper suggested it may have been rescued from the fire in which Lorne burned his records, a final defiant act to save the truth from the flames. The emotional impact on the commission members is palpable, even in their dry official report. Finch noted that after the inventory was complete, no one spoke for nearly an hour. They had unearthed not just a historical tragedy, but a story of almost mythic horror. It was a tale of a fallen house, of a king who had defiled his own kingdom and his own bloodline, and of a victim who had managed, in her final act, to leave behind a curse that would outlive him. The primary source was complete. It was a story of a crime, a lament, and a judgment, all contained in one small cypress box. The historians now understood the full scope of what they had found. They had the motive and the confession from Reverend Hale's journal. They had the physical proof of the victims in the infant skeletons. And now they had the testimony and the curse from the victim herself. The case was closed, not in a court of law, but in the court of history. The silence of the Lorne estate had been filled with a story more terrible than any of the local legends had ever dared to imagine. The chest and its contents were carefully packed and transported to the state capital, where they would become a permanent, if little-known part of the state archives. The objects themselves, the tiny bones, the lock of hair, the scorched page, became artifacts, their emotional power contained behind museum glass. But for the men who found them, the interpretation was clear. They had looked into the heart of a darkness so profound that it had consumed an entire family, and they had heard the final, desperate word of the woman who had been its primary victim. The discovery of the chest and its horrifying contents did not, in the end, lead to a grand public reckoning. Instead, the consequences were muted, the story absorbed and sensationalized by the local press before fading back into the realm of macabre local lore. An article published in the Helena Weekly Clarion in October of 1892, under the headline "Grisly Discovery at the Old Lorne Place," described the finding of the infant skeletons. The report focused on the ghoulish aspects of the discovery, but missed the central, terrible truth of the incestuous crime. It was framed as a sad, but not entirely surprising tale of the brutalities of the slave era. Another dark chapter in a history the New South was eager to forget. The true, detailed findings of the Historical Commission, including the contents of the scorched Bible page, were confined to their official report. This report was filed away in the state archives, a document of profound historical importance that would be read by only a handful of scholars and clerks for the next several decades. The full story was preserved, but it was not disseminated. The legacy of Edward Lorne's crime, for a time, remained as buried in the bureaucracy of history as the chest itself had been buried in the earth. The public was given a ghost story, not the devastating truth. The Lorne family name, once prominent in Phillips County, vanished from the records. Census data shows that Edward Lorne's abandoned legitimate son was sent to live with distant relatives in the East, his name changed to protect him from the lingering scandal associated with his father's financial collapse and sudden disappearance. The direct lineage in Arkansas ceased to exist. The family effectively erased itself from the state's history, a second, more gradual bonfire of the records that completed the work Edward Lorne had started on that frantic night in 1851. The legacy of Abigail Lorne is even more ephemeral. After being sold south in the chaotic dismantling of the plantation, she disappears completely from any verifiable historical record. There is no bill of sale with her name on it, no entry in the ledgers of another plantation that can be definitively linked to her. She became one of the millions of black souls swallowed by the vast anonymous engine of the domestic slave trade, her individual story lost to its maw. Her only surviving legacy is the chest, her final desperate act of remembrance, and the scorched curse that now rests in a climate-controlled archive. The land itself became the most enduring monument to the tragedy. The Lorne plantation was never re-established. The land was deemed unlucky, cursed. Oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s contain multiple references from local residents, both black and white, to the Lorne Hollow. They speak of it as a place where crops refuse to grow, where livestock are born sick or deformed, and where an unnatural silence pervades, even on a summer's day. The land, it seemed, held the memory of the crime, refusing to grant absolution or allow for a new beginning. This legacy of a cursed place is a common feature of Southern folklore, a way for communities to process and contain traumas too difficult to confront directly. The story of the Lorne estate was transformed from a specific, documented crime into a generalized, supernatural haunting. This transformation served a social purpose. It allowed the community to acknowledge the darkness in its past without having to confront the specific, uncomfortable truths about incest, miscegenation, and the profound moral hypocrisy of the patriarchal slave system. The horror was real, but its source was safely displaced onto the realm of ghosts and curses. It was not until the mid-20th century, with the rise of a new generation of historians focused on the social history of slavery, that the Commission's report was rediscovered and its full significance understood. The story of Abigail and Edward Lorne began to be cited in academic circles as a particularly stark and well-documented case of the destructive potential of absolute power and the way in which slavery obliterated the most fundamental human taboos. The legacy of the crime shifted from folklore to historical case study. The final piece of the documented consequences came with the DNA testing in the late 1990s. This brought the story full circle, confirming with scientific certainty what Reverend Hale had discovered through observation and what Abigail had confirmed with her curse. The genetic link between the Lorne descendants and the infants in the chest was established, making the crime undeniable in the modern age. This scientific postscript served as a final, definitive rebuke to the decades of silence and obfuscation. The legacy of the Lorne family, then, is a complex tapestry of public sensation, academic study, and deliberate forgetting. It is a story of a truth that was buried, transformed into legend, and finally painstakingly reconstructed from the fragmented evidence left behind. The consequences were not a swift and satisfying justice, but a slow, uneven process of discovery, a testament to the fact that the dead do not always rest, and the most terrible secrets have a way of eventually, stubbornly, finding their way into the light. In the final analysis, the story of the Lorne plantation serves as one of the most disturbing and complete examples of how the institution of chattel slavery functioned as a crucible for moral monstrosity. The power granted to a master was absolute, not just over the labor of the enslaved, but over their bodies, their bloodlines, and their very history. Edward Lorne's lineage project was not an aberration from the system, but the logical extension of its core principle, the complete commodification of human life. His crime was unique only in its incestuous nature, not in its underlying assumption of ownership and control. The case is now cited in academic circles as a stark illustration of how slavery's violent obliteration of kinship among the enslaved could, in its most depraved moments, circle back to consume the kinship of the enslavers themselves. In a system that legally denied the legitimacy of slave families, refusing to recognize the bonds between husband and wife or parent and child, the sacredness of all family bonds was ultimately weakened. Edward Lorne, by refusing to recognize Abigail as a human being with a right to her own children, ultimately failed to recognize her as his own sister. The dehumanization he projected outward ended up corrupting him from within. The role of Reverend Marcus Hale is also critical to the story's legacy. He represents the potential for individual conscience to penetrate the wall of collective denial. He arrived as a functionary of the very society that enabled Lorne, but his commitment to a truth that transcended social convention forced him into the role of an unwilling prophet. His journal is a priceless historical document, a testament to the moral struggle of a man confronted with an evil for which his theology had not prepared him. He is a reminder that even within the most corrupt systems, there can be moments of individual moral clarity, however catastrophic their consequences. Abigail Lorne, though almost entirely voiceless, remains the story's moral center. Her legacy is one of profound resistance in the face of absolute powerlessness. Unable to save her children or herself, she instead focused on saving the truth. The creation of the chest was a radical act of archival defiance. She curated a collection of evidence, a portable crime scene, and buried it with a curse that was also a testimony. She could not get justice, so she ensured that the memory of the injustice would survive, a historical time bomb waiting for a future generation to discover. Her final act was to ensure that her story and the story of her children would not be entirely erased. The scientific confirmation via DNA analysis provides a modern coda to this historical tragedy. It bridges the gap between the dusty, ambiguous past and the certainty of the present. It validates the fragmented evidence of the historical record, the journal, the ledger, the scorched Bible page, and proves that the horror was not a legend, but a biological fact. This intersection of historical investigation and modern science gives the Lorne case a particular power, grounding its almost mythic horror in irrefutable empirical truth. The blood of the victims still speaks, not through curses, but through genetic markers. Yet despite the wealth of evidence, a final haunting question remains, a testament to the gaps that will forever exist in the historical record. The plantation birth ledger, as recorded by Reverend Hale, listed 2 births to Abigail, corresponding to the 2 infant skeletons found in the chest. But Hale's journal also noted her age as 23 in 1851, and the ledger entry marking her for breeding was dated to 1849. This leaves a potential gap, a period of time in which other children could have been conceived and born, unrecorded even by the sparse and brutal logic of the plantation's own records. This possibility transforms the story from a contained tragedy into a potentially larger and even more horrific crime. The 2 infants in the chest may not have been the only ones. They may have simply been the ones for whom Abigail was able to create a memorial. What of the others? Were there more children transferred or disposed of in ways that left no trace? This question can never be answered. It hangs over the story, a reminder of the inherent silences in the archives of the oppressed. The story of the Lorne plantation therefore ends not with a full stop, but with an ellipsis. It is a chilling reminder that what we know of the past is often only a fraction of what was suffered. The chest provided a terrible final answer to the mystery of JL and ML, but the silence that surrounds the rest of Abigail's life and the potential for other unrecorded children is in many ways just as terrifying. The historical record testifies to 2 children. We are left only to wonder how many others were sown and reaped in that terrible, damning silence. In that sense, the legacy of this dark family crime is not just the story of what happened, but also a profound and disturbing meditation on what can never be known. It speaks to the countless stories of resistance, suffering, and survival that were lost to the fires of history, leaving behind only whispers, cursed land, and the occasional miraculous discovery of a truth that refused to stay buried. The search for these truths continues, a moral obligation to listen for the voices that still echo from the silent places of our shared past. The stories of those who were silenced are the ones that demand to be heard the most. They remind us that history is not a static record, but a living investigation, and that the search for truth is a moral duty. If you believe that some stories must be told, that some secrets must be unearthed, then join us in this work. Subscribe to Before the Story and become part of a community dedicated to honoring the past by understanding it. Click the bell to ensure the whispers of history never miss you. We'll see you in the next investigation.